Tonight on Bridge City News, a Cardston doctor has been suspended from the AHS over comments he allegedly made about Indigenous people. Police are warning of online job fraud where scammers try to get your personal information. And Bridge City News had a chance to catch up with a couple of Hollywood big shots in Calgary recently to talk about their new movie. Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. A local doctor has been suspended from Alberta Health Services after allegedly telling some homeless Indigenous people to get jobs back in May. Dr. Lloyd Clark is now on administrative leave as Associate Medical Director for the Southern Region, but continues to practice medicine in Cardston. Scott Manyhorse said Clark told he and some friends to stop hanging around being vagrants and to go out and get jobs. We reached out, but I've yet to hear back from Dr. Clark. With most job searching now taking place online, scammers now have opportunities to collect personal information. As Ben Matichuk reports, there are red flags you can watch out for to protect yourself.
The days of walking into a building to hand in your resume seem to be all but gone, which means someone can job hunt from the comfort of their own home. While this might make the process more convenient for both parties, it's opened the door to opportunities for scammers to try to acquire an applicant's personal information.
Given that online applications are pretty common nowadays, I would suggest that people really do some research on where they are applying to. So if it's a company that they're not familiar with, I'd recommend that they really start doing either some open source Google searching. They can access different business directories, Better Business Bureau as an example.
We had a situation ourselves where we had a third-party website that we had posted through Indeed. We had our account hacked, and they sent out an email to everybody that had applied to any recent postings asking for their email address, their full name, and their phone number, and with the promise of them almost being hired.
The breach is one that lasted less than a day, and it remains to be seen what could even be done with minimal information such as that. But the very fact that anyone would ask for that is a red flag.
A situation where they've maybe already included information on their resume and they've asked for that again, that would be a concern.
That's what might reflect that someone with bad intentions is on the other end, and if they can somehow access more personal information, that's where there could be serious trouble.
Date of birth, social insurance number, healthcare number, passport number, those other more important sort of government identification documents, those are where the concern comes in. And the concern would be that people will use that information for financial gain, typically, or just to take your identity.
Though there are complications with job hunting almost exclusively taking place online, there do seem to be two simple rules that one can follow. Don't give out your social insurance number before you've been hired, and don't give out information already provided on your resume. For Bridge City News, I'm Ben Matichuk.
PharmaSave is reminding prescription drug users to bring in unused medication, including liquids, along with over-the-counter medication. Recycling takes place year-round, but the company is reminding us that if you have prescription meds, to not throw them out, but to bring them in.
If you look at preventing kids or other adults from getting these medications, or even animals getting into these medications, we want to make sure that someone who knows what they're doing with them is actually getting rid of them. Last year in Canada alone, 725 tons of prescription and over-the-counter medications were returned for disposal to pharmacies across Canada.
Jan Remillard added not to bring in needles or anything explosive such as inhalers. Those looking to recycle should pour tablets into a bag while keeping liquids in their original container, with personal information being removed. 2 people were killed after an accident last night just outside of Morinville, north of Edmonton. RCMP say the collision between an SUV and a car occurred at the intersection of Highway 37 and 44 around 8 o'clock last night. A westbound SUV struck a southbound sedan. The occupants of the car, an adult male and female, were killed, while the occupants of the SUV were uninjured. The collision remains under investigation. A recent report says a Nigerian man who died following an altercation with 2 border agency officers on a plane in Calgary had been detained for 2 weeks before the incident. Documents from the Immigration and Refugee Board show that 49-year-old Bolani Alo came to Canada in 2005 to make a refugee claim on humanitarian grounds. The documents, however, say he was ordered to be removed from Canada in February and was held in custody because of statements he made about how he would disrupt any removal from Canada. His family's lawyer says Alo's wife is broken and wants to know why he died. Police are still investigating his death. The city of Calgary scored pretty high in an annual ranking of the world's most livable cities. The 2018 Index of Global Livability, compiled by the Economist Intelligence Unit, ranked the Stampede City at number 4. Calgary was ranked behind Vienna, Austria, Melbourne, Australia, and Osaka, Japan. The rankings are based on stability, health care, culture, environment, education, and infrastructure. The city scored 97.5 out of 100. Other Canadian cities in the top 10 are Vancouver, which placed 6th, and Toronto, which came in 7th. The least livable cities on the list included Dakar, Senegal, and Algiers, Algeria. A Canada-U.S. border crossing in Manitoba has been partially closed, but it is not because of national security. Officials say the crossing at Cartwright has been closed indefinitely after asbestos was found at the Canadian facility. The closure will only affect northbound traffic heading into Canada from the United States. Southbound travelers who are leaving the country will not be impacted. The Canada Border Services Agency says once a solution has been found, they'll be advising the public about when the crossing will reopen. Ontario says it will begin selling recreational use cannabis online as of October 17th. Private retail stores will be supplying pot after April 1st of next year. The province says consumers will only be allowed to use legalized pot in private residences.
Our retail model will begin with an online channel. Today, we are confirming that consumers over the age of 19 will be able to buy cannabis online from the Ontario Cannabis Store website, beginning on October 17th. With this online channel, Ontario will meet the federal obligation that provinces be ready for retail sales for the start of legalization. We have every confidence in the Ontario Cannabis Store to safely sell cannabis online with safe home delivery across the province, including a robust verification system. Today, we are also announcing that over the longer term, Ontario will move towards enabling private retail of cannabis. The Government of Ontario will not be in the business of running physical cannabis stores. Instead, we will work with private sector businesses to build a safe, reliable retail system that will divert sales away from the illegal market.
Thousands remembered the 4 victims of last Friday's shooting in Fredericton, New Brunswick, by joining hands on a walking bridge. The city's mayor, Mike O'Brien, says the city will heal together.
My city's hurt, and they're grieving, and they're hurt deeply, right? Our city staff are working on adrenaline and covering for everybody, and it's marvelous to see. Just an honor to be a mayor of a city, of the staff that we have here. But the city's coming together. I've said repeatedly, we're mourning together and we'll heal together.
Friday afternoon, when I was really sad, I wanted to do something to help people come together so we could share our emotions, our feelings, and our love together, and hopefully that would help us to heal.
But it's a wonderful idea because people want to be out. They want to see their neighbors. They want to share their pain and their grief and their frustrations and their fears and their hopes for how we're going to get out of this. And we will. This is a resilient city. I've said we got a broken heart, but we've got a strong spirit and pulse. So we'll come out of this.
Ottawa is sending 200 Canadian Armed Forces members to BC to help with mop-up operations that contain the spread of wildfires. Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale says the feds accepted a formal request for help from BC as close to 600 wildfires continue to burn across the province. He says aircraft will be sent to transport firefighters, support medical evacuations, and move people in remote communities out of harm's way. The province says so far, about 3,000 residents have been forced to flee their homes. Another 17,000 have been told to be ready to leave at a moment's notice. The California fire has killed 7 people and destroyed over 1,000 homes in the Carr region. Samaritan's Purse sent out a team of volunteers to Charlotte's property to help her sift through anything that may have survived the flames. Now, while digging through the ashes, a beautiful treasure was uncovered.
It was awful. It was just the worst. I've never seen that color before. And then in the TV in back of me, it said it had jumped the river right down here. And I looked at her and I said, we gotta go. And then we just got out. The highway patrol, when they were cruising our streets, stopped and took a picture for me and texted it to me. And you know, I really realized how hard that was for him, because he just said, so sorry, Charlotte. We have 110 homes in this particular place, and 46% of them are gone. And this is just tragic. For 20 years, I was a volunteer fire person, and I love helping people. I love it. It's harder to take it, you know, to be on the receiving end. And I'm learning this week that I have to allow someone else to feel good about helping me. You finish up a wonderful job, you got to finish up the cookie too.
Okay. You know, you work out in the sun and you sweat, but you don't think about that when you go home. You think about, did you see the smile or the tears when they found a little piece of burnout jewelry and you gave it to them?
When I came up, the whole crew from Samaritan Purse was here and ready, willing, and able to go through some of my stuff to find things that mean a great deal to me. These are what the volunteers this afternoon found, and it's pretty special to me because it's my late husband's dog tags from the U.S. Army, and I didn't think I'd ever see them again. You know, they probably wouldn't mean anything to anybody else but me, but they're just precious to me. And I am so thankful these wonderful volunteers found them.
Charlotte was completely overwhelmed to see dozens of orange shirts descend on her property and start to help her recover from the fire. Over and over again, she just kept remarking how it's such a blessing to see people who I don't even know come work in the heat, in the dirt, in the ashes, and help me start to get back on my feet.
It's priceless to know that someone is there looking for your stuff for you, not for them. It doesn't mean they're getting anything out of it. They're just doing it as volunteers, and that's just so admirable to me, and I'm so appreciative. God has walked me through this, trying to recover from this, and I know it's a process, and I don't know why this happened, and I'm not here to question. I'm just here to take care of what needs to be taken care of with the help of wonderful people. It's the old song, he just walks with me and he talks with me, and I can feel him just wrapping his arms around me and telling me it's gonna be okay. But he has been there with me in each and every one of those times. And I could not make this. I could not do this without knowing he was with me. I couldn't. I have my Lord with me, and that's good enough for me.
Just hours after he'd been arrested for assaulting his wife, a Utah man flew a small plane into his own house. The pilot, Dwayne Ewart, died. His wife and a child who were in the home at the time survived. The crash occurred about 2:30 in the morning at Payson, a city of about 20,000 people located 100 kilometers south of Salt Lake City. A bridge collapsed earlier today in the Italian city of Genoa during a violent storm, sending vehicles plunging into a heap of rubble. Italian officials say more than 25 people were killed. Some, however, have been found alive in the debris and were rescued. Police in London, England say a car crashed into barriers outside of the Houses of Parliament today, and there were a number of people that were injured. Police say the driver of the car, a man, was arrested at the scene after the incident occurred earlier this morning. Authorities are treating the incident as an act of terror. Producers just wrapped up filming the Hollywood movie called East Texas Oil in Calgary. The film stars Kevin Sorbo and John Ratzenberger. Bridge City News had a chance to catch up with the two veteran actors at Heritage Park and asked, what's the movie all about?
Well, it's a true story based on two con men that would take money from widows and fake oil wells, and they actually end up striking oil. And they have to make a decision because pretty much wherever they go, they sell more than 100% of the shares. And in this case, it was about 500% of the shares. So they have to make a decision. Do we do this out of our ego, or do we get the heck out of Dodge? And
This is a true story?
True story.
And the interesting thing to me always was the oil that they struck was the largest oil strike in the world at that time.
Watch for East Texas Oil hitting the big screen in the spring of 2019. It was on this date that a blackout hit the northeastern seaboard of Canada and the United States. British troops arrive in Northern Ireland, and comedian Steve Martin is born. This is Today in History for August the 14th.
August 14th, 1945.
This is a victory of more than arms alone. This is a victory of liberty over tyranny.
In Washington, President Harry Truman announces Japan's unconditional surrender, ending World War II. Weeks later, a surrender ceremony on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay formally concludes 6 years of fighting in Europe and the Pacific. 2003. 50 million people lose power as a huge blackout hits the northeastern United States and parts of Canada. An Ohio-based utility later receives much of the blame for the outages, which highlight the condition of North America's power grid. 1935.
Today, a hope of many years standing is in large part fulfilled.
In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signs the Social Security Act. The law provides retirement income to elderly Americans and other government benefits to this day. 1969. British troops arrive in Northern Ireland. They are sent there to intervene amid a surge in sectarian violence between Protestants and Roman Catholics. But that violence continues to flare in the troubled province until a peace process emerges decades later. 1980. During the Cold War, workers begin a strike at the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk, Poland. The job action leads to the Solidarity labor movement, the first independent union behind the Iron Curtain. Solidarity helps topple communism in Poland by the end of the decade. And 1945. Steve Martin, actor, comedian, writer, and producer, is born in Waco, Texas. Today in History, August 14th. Camille Bohannon, The Associated Press.
The hazy and smoky conditions have returned to our area, and so have the hot temperatures. How long will they last? I'll have a complete look at the weather forecast coming up in just a moment. We had another air quality statement today from Environment Canada, thanks to the BC smoke making its way across southwestern Alberta. Tonight, hazy with a low near 12. Tomorrow it should be mainly sunny with a high near 31 expected. Thursday cooling off slightly to 29. Friday lots of sunshine again with a high near 30. A low pressure system returns just in time for the weekend. Expect showers and a high of 24 on Saturday, rain and 23 on Sunday. Checking our almanac, the average high for this time of year is 26 degrees with an average low of 10. The highest temperature on this date was recorded in 1994 at 37 degrees, and the record low was 3 in 1955. Sunrise was at 6:20, sunset at 8:52. Let's have a look at tomorrow's forecast for cities across the country. Many parts of BC were also under an air quality advisory as well today. Vancouver should be sunny and 24 for tomorrow. Pretty much the same picture in Victoria. Smoky and hazy in Calgary tomorrow with a high near 30. Edmonton will also have air quality issues and should see a high near 26. Regina will be sunny and 30 tomorrow. Saskatoon will have lots of sunshine and 30. Winnipeg will have a mainly clear sky and 28 tomorrow. A mixture of sun and cloud expected in Toronto with a high near 31. There's a chance of showers expected in Ottawa tomorrow and a high near 29. A good chance of rain as well in Montreal and a high near 28. Over in the Maritimes, Fredericton, New Brunswick will have thunder showers and a high of 25. Halifax, Nova Scotia should also receive rain and 25. Charlottetown, PEI had a heat warning today. Tomorrow, a 30% chance of rain and a high of 28. In St. John's, Newfoundland, rain at 27 is expected for Wednesday. Canada's Minister for Public Safety has told delegates at the International Commission on Irrigation and Drainage that flood and fire losses are costing taxpayers billions a year. Ralph Goodale told the conference in Saskatoon that climate change has resulted in storms that dump a year's worth of moisture in a few days, followed by severe drought. Goodale says the proof is in the amount of money Ottawa has spent to clean up the flood and fire damage under the Disaster Relief Program. He says Canada spent more in the last 6 years cleaning up from floods and wildfires than in the entire history of the program dating back to 1970. Tesla is forming a special committee to evaluate any proposals to take the company private. The formation comes a week after Elon Musk said he was considering the move. Musk tweeted August 7th that he had funding secured to buy Tesla shares at $420 per share, but it appears as though funding may not be locked up. In a prepared statement today, Tesla gave no assurances of a proposal to take the electric car maker private. There's also no guarantee it would accept a proposal from Musk if he makes one. Coca-Cola is buying a minority ownership stake in sports drink maker Body Armor. It's the latest move by the world's largest beverage maker to diversify its offerings. Now, under the deal, Coke will increase its stake in Body Armor, which will get access to Coke's bottling system. The company says that would increase distribution. Now, you may think you've stopped Google from storing your location by turning off the location history setting, but you'd be wrong. A recent investigation shows that Google keeps a record of your movements even when that history setting is paused.
The location history setting sounds like if you turn it off, Google will stop recording your location. But what we found is that's not true. There are a bunch of other things that it does in the background that actually pinpoints your location with timestamps to your Google account. Our concern is it's not explained very clearly. It's not explained in an upfront way that people can find easily. And their location is being tracked in the background. And this is a very dangerous piece of information. It can identify you. It can pinpoint where you live, where you work, where you shop, and other places where you maybe don't want to share where you've been.
And this seems like a pretty clear-cut case of a company saying one thing, that they allow users to turn off location tracking, and doing a different thing. It's also very significant because of the unique sensitivity of location data, and in particular cell phone location data. We carry cell phones with us everywhere we go every day. The Supreme Court recognized this just a few months ago in the Carpenter case. It's absolutely possible to regulate this in the same way that, as automobiles became more proliferated and there were accidents, that we decided that we don't want people dying in car accidents, and we're going to implement safety regulations, including seatbelts, including speed limits. I think it's the same problem here, where we have industries proliferating that are collecting and amassing personal data in ways that we as a society don't accept, and we can absolutely regulate that.
Talk about Big Brother watching. Now here's a look at today's markets. Recapping one of our top stories this hour, a local doctor has been suspended from Alberta Health Services after allegedly telling some homeless Indigenous people to get jobs back in May. Dr. Lloyd Clark is now on administrative leave as Associate Medical Director for the Southern Region, but still continues to practice medicine in Cardston. When you see news happening, drop us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. And if you missed any of today's top stories, check out our full newscast online at bridgecitynews.ca. The Taliban is making major inroads in parts of Afghanistan, and hundreds of people are losing their lives as a result. We have an update next with our foreign affairs expert, Lisa Daftwari. But first, here's a look at what's happening in and around your community.
Here's your Bridge City News community calendar. The 7th annual Lethbridge Electronic Music Festival is taking place Saturday, August 18th from 11 a.m. to 11 p.m. at Galt Gardens in downtown Lethbridge. This event will feature 3 stages and 30 acts spanning various genres of electronic music. Also, enjoy artisan vendors, food trucks, face painting, a kids zone, and much more. Admission is free. For more information about this event, visit lemf.ca. Farming Smarter is hosting its 3rd annual Open Farm Day adventure on August 18th from 10:30 a.m. to 2 p.m. at the Farming Smarter site located on Jail Road. Discover new farming technologies, tour active research plots, and enjoy Tabor corn and a barbecue. Lots to see and do at the Open Farm Day Adventure. For more details and to register for this event, visit farmingsmarter.com. The Lethbridge Association of the Blind provides numerous activities for the blind and visually impaired in the Lethbridge area. These events include dinners with entertainment, local museum tours, and much more. For more information, call 403-942-1677 or email brownwj@shaw.ca. And that's your Bridge City News Community Calendar.
The European Union has asked Saudi Arabia to shed some light on the arrests and charges facing women's rights activists. They say the detainees should really be granted due process to defend themselves. That's what Canada has been saying all along, but those sentiments have caused diplomatic rifts between Saudi Arabia and Canada. Joining me now from Los Angeles is our foreign affairs expert, Lisa Daftari. Now, Lisa, the EU is looking for some clarification surrounding the arrests.
Right, a very curious situation here. Why is the EU looking for clarification on human rights violations in Saudi Arabia? Are they all gung-ho? Is the EU becoming the UN? It seems like this is an opportune moment for the EU to, A, get some relevancy on the map, and more so, remember the EU is cozying up to Iran and Saudi Arabia forming two very different camps globally. So what a wonderful opportunity for the EU to kind of put a wedge in this already existing rift that exists in the Arab world. And at the same time, looking like they're doing it in the name of human rights and humanity and these specific arrests that have been made against innocent individuals. Canada, on the other hand, I know you guys have been waiting for some involvement on this, for someone to back you guys up, and it might come in the form of the EU, but I think all of this is really a public show. Saudi Arabia did not want to be singled out, especially by Canada. I think those cases are symbolic. They're slaps on the wrist for society. And the royal family just wants one thing. They want to stay in power. So they're equal opportunity. They will arrest terrorists and look like the good guys, but they'll also arrest dissenters, people who talk against the regime. So, you know, we're looking at a government, and the U.S., as we know, has stayed pretty quiet on this. We've seen some movement and some very light diet diplomacy type of comments coming out of the U.S. and the State Department on this. But remember that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia have since become closer, and I don't think it's a good time, diplomatically speaking, for the U.S. to get involved in what looks like a more personal matter between Canada and Saudi Arabia.
Lisa, Turkish President Erdogan told Turks to sell their gold in U.S. dollars to support the country's currency, which has plummeted. The value of the Turkish lira is down in large part thanks to U.S. President Donald Trump's feud with NATO ally Turkey by doubling tariffs on metals imports. Lisa, the currency has dropped more than 40% so far this year. The frenemy, as you call it.
Yes. Right. Very significant dent in the Turkish economy there. But this is all, or mostly, I should say, related to the pastor that is being kept there. An American pastor has been arrested in Turkey on very made-up bogus charges, as they often do in that part of the world. And the U.S. has called for his release, and Turkey has declined that request. So these sanctions are what the U.S. and most diplomatic nations will do in order to not negotiate with a terrorist or with an abductor or with someone holding an American hostage. Now, Turkey finds itself in the situation where its economy is tanking, but will not give in to the West. And look at Erdogan, who has put his people in this situation, a nation that is falling economically, that has wholesale arrests of policemen and teachers and journalists and photographers, basically creating a de facto dictatorship where people are afraid and walk on eggshells to not offend Erdogan. And now he's asking them to give up their gold and US dollars to help the tanking economy that he created. It's a joke, but I think a lot of the Turkish people that I've interviewed in recent months are very much cognizant of what Erdogan is doing, the fact that he's positioning himself as this de facto dictator, and they're hoping for better relations globally. They don't want to become another isolated nation in the Middle East.
Lisa, 4 days of fighting between Afghan forces and the Taliban over a key provincial capital has claimed the lives of about 100 Afghan policemen and soldiers, and at least 20 civilians have been killed. The staggering numbers were the first official casualty toll since the Taliban launched a massive assault in the capital of the Ghazni province last Friday.
Yeah, this has been an awful, awful offensive. This province is surrounded by rural areas, and the fear here is that if the Taliban is able to get full control of this area, it will cut off the civilian ability to get aid, to get any type of medical treatment, which is why we're actually focusing on this story right now, is because of the high number of casualties and the high number of injured individuals. This is 17 years of a civil war in Afghanistan, and we call it a civil war, but it's not really a civil war. This is a country, or I should say, it's been a chopped up tribal society for decades. It's always been up for grabs, and it's always been there's always been bad actors there to take advantage, and the Taliban are doing exactly that. I'm glad we're talking about that because we've ignored Afghanistan for a very long time, but this is day in and day out. The death tolls aren't as high as they are right now, but this is an ongoing crisis.
Iran's foreign minister says there is no meeting planned with U.S. officials. The Iranian president dismissed a call for talks without preconditions hours before Washington moved to impose new sanctions in line with Trump's decision to pull out of that 2015 agreement over Iran's nuclear program.
More muscle flexing from Iran. Yes, Donald Trump pulled out of that nuclear program. We put the snapback sanctions back on Iran. But in the background of all of this, you have a disenchanted Iranian people who are taking to the streets consistently with protests going on. And Iran continues, the regime there continues its nefarious activities, whether it's in Syria, whether it's Yemen. They're trying to work around these sanctions. It's become very difficult to do so because the most recent round of sanctions have been very, very targeted on segments that affect, hopefully, we hope, are so targeted that they affect the regime, mostly the regime and their activities, whether it's in putting tariffs on aluminum and steel, or putting tariffs on certain software that they can't obtain in order to take forward their weapons programs, etc. So obviously this is affecting the regime in Iran, and we're not seeing them budge on anything, whether it's human rights or pouring money into terrorist pockets. That's where we have it for now.
Let's talk a bit about France now, and they're not happy. There's a proposal on the table by the European Commission to exclude French ports post-Brexit. Now, the route is a major trade corridor between Ireland and mainland Europe, Lisa.
Yes, so new plans are being drawn up for the future of the EU post-Brexit. And of course, the main actors, being Germany and France, are quite worried and want to remain quite relevant so that their economic future is bright after Brexit takes its course. Now, if France should be cut out, that's a major port, major opportunity for business. They don't want to be cut out. They want to remain relevant, and this is the time. That's why we're seeing so much action and so many headlines coming out of Germany, France. They want their future and the future of the EU to be as strong as it possibly can, and we know that they're suffering, and we know that this current layout, or their kind of brainstorming for the future of the EU, is quite important to what it will look like.
Now, North America is dealing with some massive wildfires right now. You have them in California, the northern part of California around Redding and Sacramento. Here in Canada and British Columbia, we have them burning as well. But in India, they have flooding issues. More than 14 districts in India's Kerala state have been put on high alert as the death toll from flooding has now reached 34 or more.
Yes, this is a very sad story. We're watching, as you said, many natural disasters globally. In India, something that we're not hearing so much in the mainstream media, but these are areas in India that are A, tourist destinations, but B, not built the infrastructure not built to be able to sustain this type of rain because they haven't had it historically. I saw some of these pictures. These are ancient temples that are obviously a draw for tourists. But the upsetting news is not only that over 40,000 people have been evacuated, but that there is more rain on the way. So we hope that rescuers can get to the people in time, that people can evacuate in time, and that people are at least not in harm's way with all that damage that we're seeing on the ground there.
Tens of thousands of protesters rallied against the ruling Social Democrat government recently in cities across Romania. Lisa, the riot police were called in, fired tear gas into the crowd. Hundreds of people needed medical attention. What were the protesters so angry about?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of protests across the globe, and most of them are the same as what we're seeing in Romania. Low wages and a corrupt government. That pretty much makes the perfect storm for many of these protesters or individual, populations to run out into the streets. We know a lot of people are discontented about corrupt governments, but it's when they see the low wages and it affects their personal lives, that they can't really function economically, that the people then pour out onto the streets. And we're seeing that in Romania. The government's response to the tear gas was that this was a very proportionate response and that they kept it peaceful, and the tear gas was just to disperse the crowds from getting too close to the government buildings. But this is ongoing, and as you said, it's in a handful of cities at this point.
Now, speaking of corruption, some corruption in Kenya as authorities there arrested the head of the agency that manages public land and the boss of the state railway. Lisa, it has to do with a suspicion of corruption over land allocation for a new $3 billion railway between Nairobi and Mombasa.
Yeah, this is what happens when the Chinese pour that kind of money into a place like Kenya. Of course, the arrests have been made, and of course, there's going to be corruption. This is not surprising. We're seeing China's hand, along with a short list of other countries, but China spearheading this effort to modernize different parts of Africa. We see them putting in telephone lines. We see them putting in transportation infrastructure like we have in this case. We see them taking over the water supplies. We see them actually trying to introduce Wi-Fi into certain parts of this continent. But there's always a price with that, meaning they want to control the information, they want to control the people, they want to control that access to the continent. And here you have $3 billion being put into Kenya by the Chinese, and you have corruption and corruption and more corruption. So this is what happens when, we try to modernize places like the continent of Africa, and some arrests have been made. So hopefully this will serve as a warning to others who may think of doing the same.
Now, before I let you go, let's chat a bit more about the wildfires taking place in California. We mentioned that they're pretty bad in Northern California, around Sacramento and Redding. What about where you are, close to LA?
Close to LA, thank God, we're not feeling that smoke that was in the air not too long ago. The closest ones are a little bit over an hour away from LA, from the coasts. So thankfully, and those are more contained. The ones that are much worse are up north. And I'll share with you something that a friend of our family was sharing with us over the weekend. She said her son said that our children may never get to see Yosemite. And it really hit home because, you think of these areas, and of course you think first and foremost of the people being evacuated from these areas and how it's affecting them, their homes, their photo albums, their personal property, of course, themselves and their lives not being in danger. But then you think about the future, and you think about these forests and nature and what it means. I mean, in California, these are places where people come from all over to visit the beauty of the nature, just like in British Columbia and near where you are. It's upsetting. It's upsetting because this is damage beyond what we can conceive and what we can think about at this very moment. But of course, at the moment we think of getting people out of harm's way, of evacuation, of people getting out in time, and getting these fires contained.
Yes, and pray for those firefighters and for lots of rain as well. Our foreign affairs expert, Lisa Daftari, joining me once again via Skype from Los Angeles. Thanks a lot, Lisa.
My pleasure.
Japan recently executed the remaining members of a doomsday cult that killed 13 people and injured thousands with a nerve gas attack on the Tokyo subway system back in 1995. Canada and most Western nations have abolished capital punishment, but there's a public appetite in some countries to see it return, perhaps even in Canada. Joining me now via Skype is Dr. Richard Vatz, Professor of Rhetoric and Communication at Towson University in Maryland. Welcome to BCN, Doctor.
Thanks for having me, Hal.
Dr. Vatz, can you explain what has fueled the trend toward abolishing the death penalty over the last few decades here in Western civilization?
Yeah, I think that there is a liberal movement that people think it is cruel and inhuman to kill somebody. And the thought is that there are periodically mistakes made because once in a while, from years ago, it is found that people were executed or on death row for whom the evidence is insufficient. I don't know that we have many examples of recent people who have been executed who have been shown to not have committed the crime, which is an important distinction. But there is a general feeling that we shouldn't kill people, that when the state kills people, the state becomes, in fact, a murderer.
Now, are we 100% certain that that individual is guilty? Does DNA evidence really help? Or what percentage of time do the courts execute maybe the wrong person?
I think if you're talking about recent years in which many states looked at DNA evidence and looked at videotapes and looked at confessions, mistakes are almost never made. People are looking back many years to make the argument that mistakes are often made. They are certainly not often made, and I think recently they are virtually never made.
So any thoughts on what standards of guilt should be applied? We talked a little bit about DNA. You mentioned the taped admission of guilt. What else is there? Just to make sure we're certain here that we got the right person.
Well, the general standard is beyond a reasonable doubt. And you could have a reasonable argument as to whether you should change that standard to just make it beyond a doubt. And so you'd have fewer people who would qualify for the death penalty. But I think the death penalty is a very, very important disincentive for people who commit capital crime. And so when you have no death penalty, and also there's plea bargaining, when you have no death penalty, then you're plea bargaining down from life in prison. You're not even plea bargaining down from the death penalty. So it makes punishment more difficult. It puts the public more in jeopardy. I think it's a big mistake not to have available the death penalty in cases in which it's pretty certain as to who committed the crime. And also, people don't think about exactly what the crimes can be committed, what they are. If a person, for example, blows up let's say a middle school and kills 100 students who are under the age of 15 years of age, how in the world could you justify allowing such a person to continue living? And also, when people get life imprisonment, it doesn't mean that it stops their ability to order or intimidate capital punishment. And I think it's a bad idea not to have that available. And I think that most states will find that they make a big mistake. Let's say, for example, with Timothy McVeigh, who years ago killed, I think it was 168 people and injured 600 people. Would it be a good idea if he were still alive? Would it be a good idea if he could affect further murders? I mean, how could anybody be against his execution?
You know, I'm glad you brought up that point. Are lives potentially saved by ending a murderer's life in the fact that he or she would not be out on parole later, potentially killing more people?
Yes, in Texas, for example, they've made estimates as to when people are executed, the number of capital crimes goes down. Now, that's a state in which, different from all the other states, they execute people with some dispatch. I mean, you don't wait 10 years in Texas when a person's been found guilty of a capital crime and they're to be executed. So I think there's also a study at Emory University that indicates that there's an effect on deterrence. So deterrence is effective, but that effectiveness is attenuated when we wait 10, 15 years before executing somebody. And so you have to be able to say, under what circumstances does capital punishment really deter crime? And when people see, people very often who are not murderers say, well, gee, if I wanted to kill some people, I sure wouldn't be deterred by capital punishment. Well, if they were to kill somebody, maybe they wouldn't be deterred. But most people who are convicted of capital crime beg, plead, use every legal means possible to avoid execution. So I think there's ample evidence that execution is a deterrent.
Now, in Canada, the death penalty was abolished back in 1976, a narrow vote by Parliament. But in a recent survey, Angus Reid poll from 2012 indicates that 63% of Canadians believe the death penalty is sometimes appropriate. Have any other countries reinstated capital punishment after first abolishing it?
I don't know states that have had capital punishment after abolishing it, but I know that people regret not having capital punishment when terrible crimes are committed. I mean, the luxury of saying you're not going to have capital punishment is usually made by politicians who never have a relative who was killed, never have a relative who was tortured. And so I think that the idea that you eliminate capital punishment, even in Maryland, where they eliminated it as a possibility. In other words, they weren't doing it very often, but it's now off the books. And I think if you took a public opinion poll, it would be similar to what it is in many states, that people believe in a majority that there should be capital punishment available and that it should be used in the case of horrible crimes.
Okay, in your opinion, Doctor, in what cases should we have the death penalty implemented and other ones maybe not so much? I mean, we talked earlier about, mass killing of children, maybe killing of police officers, on-duty police officers. What are your thoughts?
I think those three examples are very good examples of cases wherein you ought to have the death penalty. Also, crimes against the state. I mean, if you have somebody who is spying, I think that spying should be a basis on which we have capital punishment. So I think there are very clear areas in which there are capital punishment, and areas in which somebody, for example, on the spur of the moment, kills somebody. Well, that is not premeditated murder. So I really don't have much difficulty if we are certain as to whom we're executing and we're certain as to the crime and the criminal. I don't really have much difficulty with the use of capital punishment as Texas uses it. And I think Texas uses it to their advantage.
Now, one of the arguments against capital punishment is that it's really a form of vengeance. Would you agree with that?
But one of the classic purposes of punishment is to have some vengeance, is to let the public believe that they're being protected, and incapacitation is one of the classic purposes, because when a person is dead, they no longer can present a threat to the population. So I'm not sure what vengeance means, except that it makes people feel better sometimes. If a person's wife or husband is killed and the killer is still in jail, that person suffers from a general fear that that person could get out and kill them. So I think that naming it vengeance sounds like it's a low order motive. But I think that giving people some peace of mind whose relatives have been killed or who are victims of a loved one having been murdered or tortured, I think that's a perfectly legitimate basis on which to, as one of the bases, to support capital punishment. The one area that is mentioned all the time by people who oppose capital punishment is rehabilitation. But there's very little evidence that rehabilitation is very effective, certainly in the cases of crime, of felonies, and in the case of murder.
Another argument that capital punishment is not even a deterrent is that part of the issue here is the fact that our legal systems tend to give the offender a very long time to appeal and delay the execution. I mean, I've heard of people in death row in the United States been on death row for 30 years. Is that why it doesn't seem to be much of a deterrent?
Well, when in fact you have a state that is well known for taking decades before effecting the death penalty, it's not a deterrent. I mean, because when people hear that it takes 10, 20, 30 years, they think, well, even if I get caught, that will never happen to me. 10, 20, 30 years, I mean, a lot of killers don't believe they're going to live past their 20s. So I think that is certainly not a basis for looking at the deterrent power of capital punishment.
Now, a lot of people say, I think you mentioned this earlier, that keeping murderers in jail for life isn't a good thing because they still have power. They can, kill witnesses, inmates, prison guards while they're in jail.
And
they can still have the power to kill people on the outside as well.
Yes, that's exactly right. They do. And in Maryland, we had a period in which a typical month would go by, and a lifer would kill either another prisoner or a prison guard. And it's just outright. Now, there was a state, I forget which state it was, which was wondering if somebody murders while being under a life sentence, should we prosecute? So, in fact, what you're saying to murderers is, once you get in, if you have a life sentence, just go ahead and murder, because there's no punishment for it. I mean, the fact that that exists should be enough to tell people we've got to have available the ability to have an execution of such a person.
You know, when some of these prisoners get consecutive life sentences, they're in prison they get a sentence of 500 or 600 years. I mean, they're there for the rest of their lives. So what have they got to lose, right?
Exactly. And that is part of what motivates people who are bored in prison, you know, and who have these hatreds periodically to try to injure or kill somebody. And people generally don't care if other prisoners are killed, but, you know, you can't have other prisoners being killed. And as I say, jail guards are in danger. And sometimes if a jail is taken over, I mean, and, you know, people can always escape as well. There really is no reason not to have available capital punishment.
Now, what methods should be used to carry out an execution? Some argue, you know, it's very inhumane, Doctor. I mean, lethal injection, hanging, electric chair, even the firing squad in some countries?
Well, in many states they use pentobarbital, which is a barbiturate, and it's probably not pleasant, but in my hierarchy of worries, the worry of making capital punishment absolutely painless is not at the top. I don't think we should have cruel and inhuman punishment, but to make this pain-free should not be the major concern of responsible citizens.
Now let's talk costs. Do you know what the numbers are in relation to the cost of life of someone behind bars compared to capital punishment?
The costs vary because sometimes you're talking about, they talk about the great costs in keeping people in prison for 10, 20, 30 years. But those costs really cannot be reduced to individuals. In other words, let's say you have a cost of $50,000 a year. That doesn't mean that if you have 10 prisoners and you eliminate one, that you're eliminating $5,000 of cost. So when they estimate these costs, these are really illusory. And there also is there's the cost of maintaining capital punishment. There's the cost of keeping people in prison. But the cost is really, it's impossible to measure, and it's really not the most salient issue when you're talking about whether we should be executing these horrible individuals.
Do we have any stats of where capital punishment is legal in the United States, in those states, of how crime has maybe gone down since it was implemented?
Well, Texas has had success with capital punishment because, in fact, they, as I say, they use it with some dispatch. You don't sit around for 10, 20, 30 years before you're executed. This doesn't mean that a person shouldn't have, and sometimes they have too much of this, legal options to investigate the matter, but sometimes these go crazy. I mean, what do you need? 5 different levels of appeal to determine if a judgment was correct or not? It's really absurd. And again, it's not a humorous thing to execute people, but sometimes it provides a tremendous service in ridding our society of the most outrageous human beings who can think nothing of ending people's lives and ending lots of people's lives.
Does society really need to pay more attention to the rights of the victims as opposed to the rights of the offenders?
Absolutely. The victims are the important people. You know, people often say, well, of course the victim thinks that, but you've got to talk to people who are not involved. Why is it irrelevant, the victims suffering in these sorts of matters? I think it's quite germane. And I think the fact that most victims, when a person who's committed a capital crime is executed, feel relief. They feel relief because not only is that person gone, but that person no longer presents a threat to them and to other people. So I think that's a very important aspect of the use of capital punishment.
I wonder what percentage as well of victims actually sit in on the execution of the person, the perpetrator, you know, the person who offended them or who, you know, raped or murdered one of their family members. And does that give them closure too, right?
I think some do, some don't. I think the word closure is a misused word. I often think that many people who have a loved one killed will never have closure, but they'll have more closure if the perpetrator is executed.
Dr. Richard Vatz, Professor of Rhetoric and Communication at Towson University in Maryland. Thanks a lot for your time today.
Thank you, Hal. I appreciate the time.
On behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless and have a great night.